Good morning, everybody. We are continuing our series through Lent today. It's called 24. Mary preached on the similar chapter in the run-up to Jesus' death last Sunday. And today we're looking at the whole theme of Jesus being on trial, the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. And we're going to get some life hacks from him today. We're all facing possibly the biggest trial our generation will have to face. New routines, new social ways of doing things, new rhythms of life to get used to amongst the anxiousness of the unknown. It could be said that it's a bit of a trial. People today will be making all sorts of judgments about how the government is handling coronavirus, how other parents are homeschooling their kids better than they are. I'm not immune to the way that feels. I'm looking at Facebook, I'm on Zoom meetings with colleagues and folks from across Sandwell, and I judge myself in that respect as well. In our own ways, we put ourselves on trial. If you've ever sat on the wrong side of the courtroom, if you've ever sat in a dock opposite a judge, I hope you haven't, but if you have, if you've ever had to promise to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth in front of that judge and a jury, you'll know that it's a scary, isolated place to be. They hold your future in your hands, in their hands, and they're looking at your past. I'm told there were two people who were involved in a car accident, and the lawyer asked the first person to stand, and he said, "What gear were you in at the time of impact?" And the witness answered, "Jeans, t-shirt and Reeboks," not the answer that he was actually looking for. I was the assistant, as you'll know, of a church in Stafford. I worked in the prison across the road as a chaplain. It was a prison, a home to over 600 men. And you know something? Not one of them in that prison was guilty. Not one of them would admit their guilt until, that is, they started to come along to Alpha. When the penny finally dropped and they began to trust us enough to admit to themselves that they were guilty not only of a crime that had bought them a ticket to sit and reside at Her Majesty's pleasure, can't say it, but that they were guilty of far more crimes against God himself with far more reaching eternal consequences. But you know, the more I read and think about Jesus's trial, the more I realise that the 6 trials that that sent Jesus to the cross provide an absolutely all-time classic example of an unfair and illegal rush to judgment. We can be quick to judge. Let's not do that. You see, Jesus wasn't a dishonest criminal or in denial about his crime like most of the guys I perhaps met in prison. The fact of the matter was that in this case, the accused was the only perfect and completely innocent person who has ever lived. And yet he was declared guilty of crimes he never committed, sentenced to death for a capital offence, which according to the first century law, Roman law at the time, was crucifixion. See, the things that amazed me about the events leading up to the crucifixion is that it all happened overnight. Everything's worse at night, isn't it? We carry anxiousness in our bodies today that will come out in all sorts of ways. Some of us are kind of a little bit zoned out at times. Some of us are kind of just not in rhythm for anything. And it causes us to feel a little bit imbalanced, a little bit anxious. But things are worse at night. Anxiety at night time seems worse than during the day. A bump in the night, as opposed to the same bump of the central heating or whatever it might be, it is always worse at night. I'm sure that you've read these chapters in the Gospels and you've heard the word watch. It's mentioned a lot in the chapters that we will have read today. Nothing to do with a piece of jewellery worn on your wrist. Now, to understand Jesus' trial, we need to understand time. Like the Romans did, we measure a day from midnight to midnight. The Jews start their time of day from 6 o'clock at night, not midnight, but 6 o'clock at night, and it finishes the following day at 6 o'clock. Nighttime hours were measured not in hours, but in watches. 4 watches, 3 hours each. So the first watch is 6 o'clock till 9 o'clock at night. The second watch is 9 o'clock till midnight. The third watch is 12 at midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning. And the fourth watch is 3 in the morning till 6 o'clock in the morning. And then the daytime hours are from 6 till 6 a.m. in the morning till 6 p.m. at night, and they're measured in hours. Confused? You will be. It's hard enough telling the time, isn't it, in a 24-hour clock. So, for example, in Matthew 27:45 tells us that from the 6th hour, darkness fell upon the land until the 9th hour. Work it out, and we'd naturally think, well, 6 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock in the morning. But no, Matthew is on Jewish time, and he starts his day at 6 a.m. So the 6th hour is noon, and the 9th hour is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day. Okay, so now we've got time sorted out, let's take a quick look as to what happened on that fateful night. Jesus has finished his meal with his disciples, the Last Supper. He's been praying in the Garden of Gethsemane whilst his disciples have nodded off, probably sometime during the third watch, midnight till 3 a.m. And it's at this point that Jesus' 6 trials began, with Judas's mob turning up sometimes after about 1 o'clock in the morning. Let's run through this together, folks. I make no apology, this is going to be a little bit Bible study-ish, but we're preparing for Easter. There's a whole new world going on at the moment, but we are going to keep our focus on Sunday mornings in particular as we approach Easter, as we would do. Great to have some normality in amongst all the change. So we're going to prepare to remind ourselves of the love of God for sending us Jesus, his son, to die for us. It's important that we don't just read this story, skipping through it like a fairy tale or a John Grisham novel. So get a pen, write some notes to remind you of the truth about Jesus's trial. Get your Bibles out. We're going to do a little bit of text jumping. I'm guessing some of you will have read some of the texts already today. John 18:12 and the verses that follow, it talks of the first 3 trials, all religious trials. And Jesus is accused of blasphemy. They say he's pretending to be God. He was God. He wasn't pretending. But this was a criminal offence, a religious offence. So trial number 1, he's in front of Annas. He's the ex-high priest, and he's ready. He's waiting. Nobody's had to drag him out of bed this morning. It's held at night with no specific charges. It's full of prejudice and violence, and it's unauthorised. And they find Jesus guilty of irreverence before sending him off to Caiaphas, who's the present high priest. And guess what? His family. He's Annas' son-in-law. So trial number 2, it's now around 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm not good at 7 o'clock in the morning, never mind 3. Amazing how everybody's wide awake and waiting. It's this pre-arranged plot that's going on. This unofficial trial is held at Caiaphas' home. He's a puppet of the Roman Empire. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, and his word goes amongst the Jews. This time they've found a couple of false witnesses to add into the mix, and it's all again illegal. And the outcome of this trial isn't just 200 hours of community service. Jesus is declared guilty of blasphemy, and he's allowed to be publicly humiliated and abused. Luke 22 and verse 66 says, when it was day. When does a day start for the Jew? 6 o'clock in the morning. They rushed Jesus to the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, 70 men who sit in ultimate authority over the Jews. And so we have trial number 3 in Mark 14, 55 to 59. Trial number 3 is also illegal. False witnesses, the accusations switched, and there's this dodgy voting system that's going on. And Jesus is then sent to this Roman official called Pilate, and he's being accused of blasphemy. 6 hours, 3 illegal trials. Violence is allowed in the courtrooms. This isn't a spur of the moment thing, folks. This has all been carefully orchestrated. And Jesus asks for truth and justice, and all they give him is this physical abuse and lies. The next 3 trials aren't religious trials. The next 3 trials are Roman and civil trials. So trial 4 is where, you see, the Jews can't issue the death penalty. They can't get rid of Jesus on their own. So they take him to somebody who could. Pilate. Pilate's around with extra troops to make sure the Passover is policed well in Jerusalem. It's heaving with people. There's no better time, if ever there was one, for Jesus to die and rise again, because word was going to get out incredibly well as people went back to their homes after Passover. So normally Pilate would be in the Mediterranean. He'd be in Caesarea. He's at his palace, living the high life, but he's in Jerusalem at this time. History books describe this man, this Pilate, as a Roman governor, thirsty for Jewish blood. And he's worked his way through the ranks, and he's been the youngest governor on record. He's the new kid on the block. He's the blue-eyed boy. And this guy was tough. He was no fool. I mean, he's mean. He's the last judge you would want normally to be placed in front of. There was a letter found, a letter to Emperor Caligula. And Agrippa wrote it, and he said this about Pilate. Pilate is unbending. He's recklessly hard. He's a man of notorious reputation, severe brutality and prejudice, savage violence and murder. That's not good to have on your CV. At the time of Jesus' trial, Pilate was on report. Rome's investigating him. And the Bible tells us that that day was this hard nut. Pilate was indecisive. He's never normally indecisive. He'd normally have thrown the Jews straight out of his palace when they came asking for something. But because he's on report, Pilate's scared. This hardened Jew-hating Roman didn't care diddly squat about public opinion normally, but because his own neck is on the chopping block, this trial means everything to him. Later in history, we're told that he was banished to the northwest of Italy, suffered a breakdown, and sadly committed suicide. What a strong man. And this was the man who would now decide the fate of the Son of God. John 18, verse 28 onwards, you can read that yourselves. But the word that worried Pilate was this word king. Blasphemy meant nothing to him. It's a religious thing to him. There were so many gods in Roman culture. Blasphemy meant absolutely nothing, which is why the Sanhedrin came to him. And that when they did, they illegally switched the charge to treason from blasphemy. They knew that Pilate wouldn't care about the blasphemy charge, but when it came to treason, his ears pricked up. Caiaphas suggested to him that Jesus was posing a threat to the government of Rome, that Jesus was plotting to overthrow Caesar. Interesting, isn't it, when Jesus himself actually taught people to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's. In other words, Jesus' teaching was respect your government, pray for them, pay them their due, do as you're told. And in this season, that's exactly what we need to do, folks. If the government say stay home, stay home. If the government say this, that, just do as you're told. God will sort the rest. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Understandably, the Sanhedrin didn't mention that bit to Pilate. Jesus was kept under arrest. No defence lawyer, just more violence. A fourth illegal trial in the dead of night. But Pilate considered Jesus innocent of any crime. He doesn't take the charge seriously. He just views Jesus as another strange, self-appointed Messiah. And there's plenty back then. There are plenty around now. And Pilate, in this fourth trial of Jesus, concludes that he kind of comes to the conclusion that they should sort it out amongst themselves. But remember, he's on report. He didn't want riots on the streets, so this weak politician wants peace at any price. If he turns Jesus loose, the Jewish leaders might get mobs to riot. So he finds a loophole. Jesus is a Galilean, so he passes the book to Herod, who's the ruler of Galilee. Seen the movie The Godfather? Well, Herod was like the godfather of the ancient world. Him and his family were renowned. They were brutal. They were cruel. They murdered their own spouses and children. And after a week of homeschool, I'm not going to go there. I'm sure you're going to do really, really well. But this family were awful. Phil Mitchell looked like an angel. Herod had already beheaded John the Baptist. It was this Herod who Jesus had called that fox in Luke 13. So here's trial 5. Jesus is before Herod. Again, it's illegal. It speaks for itself. Luke 23, 8-12 says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he'd been wanting to see him. From what he'd heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. So he plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they were enemies. And for some reason, Herod wasn't in the killing mood, shrugs the whole thing off and sends him back to Pilate. Jesus is there's this ping pong ball thing going on, and Jesus is passed from pillar to post. Nobody wants the blame. Pilate must have groaned when he looked up from his crunchy nut cornflakes that morning as he saw Jesus coming back. Jesus is still guilty of nothing. No one reliable witness, no evidence, no legal trial. So Pilate tries another approach. Jesus is beaten to within an inch of his life, and whilst Pilate washes his hands of him, taking no responsibility for this one, he fears the crowd and he asks them to decide Jesus' fate. They find Jesus guilty, and Pilate sends an innocent man to the cross and spares the cheat, the liar, the criminal, Barabbas. Why Barabbas? Why would the religious leaders, prefer to save a murderer over an innocent man? Well, because Barabbas was no threat to the religious phonies. He didn't hassle the legalists. He didn't preach love and good news on the streets. He was just engaged in mob criminal violence, killing people for the sake of it. He didn't pose any threat to anybody's hierarchy or position in society. In less than 24 hours, Jesus goes from arrest to crucifixion. At the third hour, that's not 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At the third hour, 9 o'clock in the morning, Jesus is nailed to a cross. Matthew, Mark and Luke tell us that when the 6th hour came, midday, darkness fell. And all 4 gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, tell us that at the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus died. Who was to blame? The religious authorities? The Roman system? Pilate? After all 6 trials were illegal. The first 2 were held at night. There was no defence lawyer at any of the trials. There were no reputable witnesses, and the members of the Jewish court had to adjourn to their homes, normally for 2 days and 2 nights before they heard the accused testimony a second time. And only then could they vote their verdict, one Sanhedrin member at a time. This didn't happen. Some Jewish writers of the 1st century have blamed the Jewish authorities. Some of the earliest Christian preaching blames everybody, Herod, Pilate, the Gentiles, the whole crowd. And yet over the years I've come to realise that if I'd have been there, who's to say that I wouldn't have agreed with the verdict that day, based on the stupid, the poor, the sad evidence I would have been given. The reality is that it was my sin that took him to the cross. It was me. I was involved. You were involved in that decision that day. God's decision was to send his son to the cross. Pilate, Herod, the Gentiles, the crowd, they were just part of the process. And God had decided that the only way to bring us back to himself was through a cross of Calvary. Jesus had to die. In doing what they did, the leaders were only doing what comes naturally to us all. If we take a hard look at ourselves and our motives, we can see in ourselves the same fears, the same cynicisms, the same selfishness that motivated the Sanhedrin that day. When it comes to the trials and ultimately the cross, it's not a question of blame, folks. It's a question of a great exchange. The exchange the people saw was an innocent man for a bad man. Jesus for Barabbas. Heaven saw a greater exchange, sin for death. And death, sin and death, and for forgiveness and life. Sin and death for forgiveness and life. That was the great exchange. Your sin your eventual death for forgiveness and life through the death of Jesus. You see, the question we're faced with again this morning is simply this: what am I going to do today with Jesus of Nazareth? Pilate asked the same question time and time again. Let's close, folks, by taking one more glimpse at this man's actions and make sure that they are not ours today. You see, Pilate tried to transfer his decision to Herod. In the same way this morning, we can know the story and we cannot know the Saviour. We might have dipped into the church, dipped into the Bible, the book of the Lord over the years, but today, more than ever, we need to know the Lord of the book. Do you know him? See, the cross demands a decision from every person who's ever walked and ever will walk this earth. What will you do with Jesus of Nazareth? Like Pilate was, are you trying to avoid that wholehearted commitment to him? And you may know this story really well, but can I encourage you today to accept the Saviour and get to know him? Some of us stopped at saying yes to him and yes to the story, yes to the message of hope and love through the cross of Jesus. But we've not got to know him. In this season, folks, we have a great opportunity to get to know him better, to hang on to his word, to hang on to him more. Why wait? Pilate also tried half measures. He tried to appease the crowd with a beating, with punishment instead of death, just kind of send him on his way. And I wonder, have we tried to live our Christian life full of convenient half measures and compromise? Today is a good day to give our whole lives afresh to him. There's no safer pair of hands. God doesn't do half measures, never has, never will. Pilate tried to do the right thing, to release Jesus for the wrong reason, because he hoped the crowd would choose him for release. Are we trying to leave the important decision to someone else? We've got loads of important decisions to make today. Some decisions are taken out of our hands today. We can't make them, for society's change this week. But only you can decide to follow Jesus. Only you can honour Jesus with your life and in your life. Only you can decide to honour him, live 100% for him and for the right reasons. Are you following him because he said and did some good stuff? Or are you following him because he truly is Lord of your situation? He's truly Lord of your life, the Son of God, the one who holds your life today. In all the storm and all the trauma of COVID-19, he holds your life today, but he also holds your tomorrow, and he's the key to all of eternity. Pilate chose personal ambition over honour, and then he tried to protest his innocence. He symbolically washed his hands of Jesus, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. Do we do the same? Looking back, I'm sure like me, there have been times when we've sat in church, in a church building. We can't be there at the minute, but church was never just intended to be about a building for 90 minutes a week. We're the church wherever we are. That's incredibly helpful. We're going to be doing church very differently for a little while, but church is still church. But there have been times, I'm sure, that if we look over the last few months and years, that we've sat in a church building on a Sunday and denied him on a Monday. Church, we need to stand. We need to pick up and stop mixing Bible bits and adding only the bits we like into our lives. Because we can lift our hands and sing our songs of praise, whether in our front room or in a church service, and yet deny him in our hearts and our lives, in our everyday conversations with people who are going to need to hear about God's love and his peace and his comfort more than ever at this time. Are we subtly protesting our innocence? Are we trying to cover over our sinfulness, our mess-ups, our fears from a God who sees everything and yet loves us so much that he sent his son to die to exchange our sinfulness for his goodness, his death for our life, his sorrow for our joy, hopelessness for hopefulness, even in the middle of this storm? Folks, the Bible says that one day we'll all be on trial. At the end of my life, you, me, we will all be judged. But we will be judged fairly by a friend, Jesus. Do you know him? Do you really know him? The one who was judged unfairly by mankind will judge us fairly. The biggest question you and I will have to answer is simply this one. What did you do with Jesus of Nazareth? What will your verdict be today?